And again, Sarah, thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us today and being very flexible as we navigated many different time zones to make this all work. So as Sabrina was saying, Sarah's interest in Japan was started as she participated in the kudo dojo as a teenager. In university, she studied Middle Eastern languages and civilizations, as well as Japanese at Yale. She attended the Inter-University Center from 2007 to 2008, and this was her first time in Japan. And she worked for various organizations, including Metropolis Magazine, Scene and Go, right after the IUC, and eventually made her way into her current career at Polygon Pictures, and eventually returned to the US, where she has worked with Crunchyroll and now Netflix. So in the few years since graduating the IUC, she has been quite busy. And to get us started and to share a bit more color about the exact journey and the details of her experiences, I will start off with our first question. So we found Sarah via her LinkedIn profile, and looking quickly at her experiences, it would seem as if her career has been the dream of many a Japanophile. And so, we've already briefly mentioned that your exposure to Japan was not through anime, but through your Japanese archery experience. Would you please elaborate on that and share with us how you found the dojo that you trained at?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. It was sort of one of those random twist of fate kind of things, but I happened to just, I don't even exactly remember where, but just effectively just kind of hearing about there's this thing called kudo, that's the Japanese martial art of archery, and really didn't know anything about it other than that. And I think like a lot of kids, I had done archery at summer camp and was always kind of interested in that. And so for whatever reason, I just ended up sort of looking it up online a little bit more when I got home that day. And at the time I remember thinking to myself, this sounds kind of interesting, but I'm in North Carolina of all places, there's not going to be any kudo near me. But then sort of imagine my surprise is that one of the second, hits that I got when I was looking up this was something about, announcing the opening of the Meishin Kyu Dojo in Apex, North Carolina. And I'm thinking that's about 20 minutes away from me. What's going on here? And it turns out that there's an American man and his wife. They're both Americans, but they had lived in Japan, in Tokyo, I believe, for something like 15 years and ended up studying Kyudo while they were there. They both got really proficient in it. And the man, the sensei, actually is, or at the time, he was Renshi Dokudan level and was the highest ranked Kyudo person in the entire United States. And so just sort of, there's maybe 10 Kyu dojos in the entire US. And so the fact that, one of them just happened to be kind of near me was a huge shock. When they came back to North Carolina, they had this place out in the middle of nowhere, kind of in the country, and just had built like an actual outdoor, proper, full-size Kyu dojo in the middle of the forest in North Carolina. And so I just went for a visit there. I ended up practicing there for the rest of the time that I was in high school, which was about a year and a half. And so then when I went to college, they didn't have any kudo in Connecticut or anywhere in the Northeast. But, I sort of was thinking like, oh, maybe it might be fun to study Japanese. And that's kind of how that started.
Right. Very good. That's incredible that so easily found its way literally into your backyard.
It's a very, very random thing that if I hadn't just I think it was in junior English or something. I think it was one of those, practice essays to learn about proper citation form. And I was bored in class one day and was just kind of reading ahead at all of the sample essays they had in there.
I love it. That's very cool. So throughout our prep conversations for this, you expressed that you are not necessarily a 5-year plan type of person. So again, hearing this, you would think that, okay, she experiences a bit of Japanese culture, decided right then and there to study Japanese and then go to the IUC after graduating and then find a job in Tokyo. But that wasn't really the case for you. Within your university experience at Yale, could you please share with us, you mentioned you did study Japanese, but it wasn't your major? What did you end up studying, and kind of how did you make your way into the IUC?
Yeah, at the time I sort of had an idea in my head that I wanted to maybe go into publishing, be like a book editor, and from what I had been able to kind of research about that industry at the time, it seemed pretty clear that they didn't necessarily care what you majored in, as long as it was more important to have relevant internships and that kind of thing. You didn't have to be an English major or whatever. So I went into college with a sort of a vague idea of what I wanted to do with my life, but no idea what I wanted to major in. And I had always been interested in languages in general. And so that's part of the reason why I started taking Japanese my sophomore year. And I chose that language as opposed to any of the others, mostly because I had done kudo in North Carolina. But what I ended up doing was, because at Yale, at least at the time, you didn't have to declare a major until the end of your sophomore year. So I just sort of took whatever sounded interesting for the first 2 years of college, which ended up being a really wide range of things. One of those things was taking an intro Egyptian hieroglyphs class, because that was also something that I had done like a brief, I went through an Egypt phase like a lot of people, and I'd done like a brief summer program for that when I was younger in middle school or high school. And so, finding a course where you could actually learn the language seemed really cool to me. So I took that for the first 2 years, and I think I had maybe taken a history class here and there. So when I hit the end of my sophomore year and needed to declare a major, I pretty much literally just sat down and made a list of all of the classes that I had taken up to that point and said, what am I closest to completing the requirements for based on what I've taken so far? And because of the 2 years of hieroglyphs, that happened to be basically ancient Egypt stuff. At the time at Yale, the major was Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. And most people who did that, you pick a language or an area concentration, and most people did that. It was effectively like an Arabic Middle Eastern studies major, because that was what 99% of the people who majored in that focused on. But I picked ancient Egypt as mine, because the major also, I think, covered Egyptian and maybe Sanskrit and Babylonian and a couple of other random things that no one actually ever majors in. I was the only person in my entire year that majored in that. So, yeah.
I mean, it's a very unique major. And it sounds like a great experience. Yeah.
My parents had a mild heart attack. Like, how are you going to support yourself with that? But,
of course, that's what every kid is supposed to do. So you came away with this major, and also you said 3 years of Japanese language experience. Yeah. And because of your course load, it sounded like you also didn't really have a chance to study abroad. And your year in the IUC, as you mentioned in the past, was kind of a chance to do that, get that year abroad experience, utilize your language skills, and so then. As you completed your year at the IUC, which is, very intense, and a lot of us can attest to that, what kind of made you realize that you wanted to turn this 1 year into what ended up being a 10-year-long career in Japan, in Tokyo? And can you please share kind of your steps post IUC into your first real life job?
Sure. Yeah. So as Carlton said, I originally wanted to just kind of study abroad somewhere after college. I wanted to have that year experience somewhere before I did the rest of my life. And I knew that the Light Fellowship at Yale which is specifically for language study in East Asia. And that was something that I could get that could fund that sort of year-long experience. And so when I was lucky enough to get that fellowship, that at first was just kind of my intention, I'm going to get to experience living in Japan, because I'd never been there before. I'd never lived abroad extensively before. I'm going to get to really immerse myself. And it seemed like it was going to be a lot of fun. And I definitely felt a little bit the odd man out in some ways at the center. It felt like my year, especially, pretty much everybody else was in the middle of PhD programs and, studying their thesis. And I'm just kind of here like, I want to have fun and learn Japanese. And so I was fully intending to leave at the end of the year. But what ended up happening is by the time we graduated, I felt like I'd gotten really good at Japanese and I enjoyed living in Tokyo. And I was just afraid that if I went back at that point, I would end up getting a job that had nothing to do with Japan. I would lose it. And it just felt like a waste. So, I just wasn't ready to leave yet. And so I started looking for jobs in the Tokyo area. And at the time, I was still kind of interested in that media publishing industry. So I was, looking at postings at the Japan Times and, all those kinds of things, and ended up getting a job as an editorial assistant at Metropolis Magazine, which I believe is still hanging in there. I think it's technically still around, but they're a weekly paper, free paper that does Time Out style news and events and interviews and restaurant reviews and stuff like that for in English. So it's intended for foreigners or tourists living in Japan. And that was a really, really great experience for me. It was a kind of the perfect first job in a lot of ways because it was a very small team. It was a very many hats kind of atmosphere. And I was the person who was contacting artists' reps if we wanted to interview them or if we wanted to write about a specific restaurant, calling them up and sending over kikakusho and, talking to various PR agencies and translating things to write blurbs and everything. And so it was really good to kind of get me over that hump of being comfortable speaking Japanese over the phone and being actually comfortable using all of that keigo and business Japanese that, you learn, but it doesn't ever stick in your head or actually, be able to like sura just say it until you're actually doing it every day. So it was a really, really good experience for me to get kind of used to doing that.
Right. No, definitely. And I can agree, having just graduated the year before, what you learn in the textbok and then what you use in daily life are two very different things.
You can remember it, but you have to stop and think, like, am I supposed to say like sasete itadaku here? Or like, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah. Oh, go. Yeah. No, I hear you. So you were there in that space for about 2 years until you eventually made your way to the largest company you've worked for in your experience at Polygon Pictures.
Yes.
So for those of us who are very unfamiliar with the CG, computer graphics animation industry, would you please give us a brief rundown of the firm and what role they play and kind of anything that we may have seen by them as a casual anime viewer?
Yeah. So, Polygon Pictures is a computer animation studio, which is distinguished from most anime, which is traditional 2D hand drawn. So it just refers to anything where, the characters and the animation is done in the computer. But as a CG studio, the majority of the work that Polygon did would be for US clients. So like working with Disney or Hasbro or Netflix recently, because I think as most any anime fan is aware, when you think of Japanese anime, you think of 2D, you think of hand drawn. And there really, until a few years ago, there really was no such thing as CG anime. It just didn't exist. So because of that, Polygon was sort of in an interesting position because they're a very long-standing company. They were founded in, I think, 1983 or something like that. But they were largely unknown within Japan because they mostly did work for overseas. So, for example, some of the projects that I worked on several different Transformers animated series. So I sort of have a soft spot for Transformers because that's what I worked on a lot. We did some Star Wars. We did several episodes of the Clone Wars series. I worked on the other Lucasfilm animated show called Star Wars Resistance that aired a few years ago. And then I've worked on an Amazon Prime kids show called Lost in Oz. So there's a lot of things like that. But then the other part of that is that in the last few years, there has been a really big advancement in the technology to be able to have computer generated characters and computer generated animation that actually looks realistically 2D and hand drawn. And so that's why there's actually quite a bit of Japanese anime recently that is CG and that is done in the computer. And there's also a lot of hybrid things. I've worked on some shows where, for example, the characters were computer generated, but the backgrounds and maybe the effects like explosions and fire were hand drawn and things like that. So it's been really interesting to kind of see the growth in the industry. And so then because of that, Polygon started making some anime for the Japanese market as well.
Interesting. So they kind of were more of an exporting unit and then returned and started producing products for their own home country.
Once you actually could make computer animation for Japan. So they've made a lot of things that have been on Netflix. There's a series called Knights of Sidonia, Sidonia no Kishi, Ajin, Blam. There was some Godzilla anime movies that aired a few years ago from Toho. That was all Polygon. Some recent stuff is, I think, Kute no Dragon and Levius. So.
Very cool. I'm a fan of Ajin myself, actually.
Oh, really? That's great.
The work that you did there is very different than your work immediately post after IUC. So would you please share with us kind of that transition for you? How did you get started at Polygon Pictures?
Yeah, when I first joined there, it was actually as a translator interpreter, because being a company that, for one, worked with lots of American clients, and then also in the computer animation industry, you tend to hire animators from all over the world. So there was a good, decent percentage of people from India or Malaysia or Europe or, all over. So there were a lot of staff within the studio as well who didn't speak Japanese. And of course, the majority of the Japanese staff also didn't speak English. So there was a core team of about 7 or 8 full-time translator interpreters who really just do everything. Every single email, every single meeting, anything where there's a Japanese speaking person and a non-Japanese speaking person, we were kind of there. So when I joined at the time, I was just looking for translation jobs in general. I didn't know anything about CG or animation really, but it seemed like fun. It seemed like more fun than translating something, hugely technical or boring. And so I kind of jumped at the chance. And it was really great because it was very much a crash course for me in kind of all things animation and just seeing how it's all made, seeing all of the parts of the process, what goes into it, what everyone's job was. When there was a director who's talking to one of the animators or one of the layout artists and giving them feedback on the composition of a scene and the camera angles and how the character movement and facial expression looks, we were translating that. So it was really like a huge range of things. And it was also very difficult because there's a lot of highly technical language, so people are telling me things like, talking about baking keys and, nodes. And it's like, I understand the individual words that you're saying, but none of it means anything to me. And now I have to figure out how to say it in Japanese. So you have to kind of have a willingness to just take a deep breath and go for it and get really good at reading the other person, feeling like they seem like they understand what I'm saying. So I must be making sense, but yeah.
So it's not just English to Japanese or Japanese to English. It's kind of a whole different language in both languages at the same time.
It really is. And especially with sort of the uniqueness of Japanese, there's certain, CG specific terms that when you say them in Japanese, you actually would say the Japanese equivalent, you would translate it. But then there's other ones where the Japanese term for it is just the katakana of the English. And, so you even have to kind of figure out which is which with that, because it's not always just the katakana version or vice versa.
Exactly. That sounds very, very interesting to observe, but I don't know if I could do it myself. So your language skills were this key to get you into Polygon Pictures. In this industry that you have had interest in, sounds like for some time. But then when would you please share with us how you got your first opportunity to work on the production side of things rather than your language heavy skill set?
Yeah, so I was a translator. I was on the translation team there for, I think it was about 2 years and change. And as I kind of, got over that 2-year hump, I started thinking about what it was that I wanted to do next. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a translator for the rest of my life. And I also kind of felt like I didn't have a lot of experience in other areas that could help me if I ever decided I wanted to do something different. And then that combined with the fact that having kind of, been sort of the fly on the wall and in the entire process of all of the animation that was going on there, I got to see in particular the production staff, which is what we call the production coordinators, production managers, the people who are effectively the project managers of the series. So they're keeping, schedule, budget, organization, all of that kind of thing. And I had gotten to see them in action and see kind of what their day-to-day job was like, and became really interested in that side of things. So initially, I just approached one of the other producers at Polygon, who's another American, and just kind of to pick his brain because, as one of the other few actually Americans at the company, he had been a very good friend to me, a good mentor. And so I just wanted to kind of talk to him about how he got into the industry, what his path had been like, if there was any opportunity for me to maybe take that step at some point. And we sort of just had the one conversation about it. And immediately he was like, well, we have this show that's starting and we're staffing up and I still need another episode coordinator for it, which is kind of the entry level role in that department. And so we said, why don't you just start there. And so I had kind of been thinking maybe in 6 months to a year, I might make this transition. And then, within the span of that conversation, it was like, can you start next month? And it was sort of a huge, like, oh gosh, is this too soon? What am I doing type of a thing, but just kind of went for it. And it ended up being a really, really great experience.
Right. Not only a great experience, but also just changed the entire course of your career. It sounds
really did. Yeah. So the first show I worked on was a show called Transformers, Robots in Disguise. It's sort of a 2D CG hybrid show that aired in the US. It's for kids. And so I was an episode coordinator on the first season of that, and then moved up to production manager for the second season, which, an episode coordinator is kind of, you're in charge of one specific team. You have one line of production that you're overseeing, and it's a very granular type of management job. And then production manager is kind of one step above that. You are a little bit more big picture. You're managing the other coordinators and dealing a little bit more with the overall schedule of the production, as opposed to just your team's deadlines. And then after doing that for a while, we got another show, which I briefly mentioned before, is an Amazon Prime show called Lost in Oz. That's sort of a modern day, like Wizard of Oz riff. It's really fun, actually. But anyway, so I became the line producer on that show. And then the line producer is kind of yet another step up where you're really in charge of, you're dealing with creating often the entire schedule of the production from the beginning. You're also really heavily dealing with the budgets of everything, tracking everyone's man hours and what the monthly costs are and reconciling that to figure out what our forecasted profit percentage is going to be. And so I was doing that. And then as I continued at Polygon, I was the line producer on several more shows until I decided to come back to the US. But one of the great things that happened while I was working on Lost in Oz actually is we were nominated for a daytime Emmy. And actually, because Amazon was very generous, and even though we were sort of the vendor studio in that production, they had, they were the ones who came up with the creative of the show and then just kind of hired us to make it, but they still included us on sort of the list of, the people who are actually specifically named in the Emmy nomination. And we actually got to come to LA and go to the daytime Emmy ceremony, and we actually won. And so I do have my own little Emmy, which fun because I think not many people in my point in the career would have been able to actually have one of these yet. It's very heavy. You could really bash someone over the head with it.
That's incredible. I'm sure that felt amazing, and it's nice having an extra weapon in your home just in case.
Yeah, it's both heavy for slamming and it's also pointy, so double.
Right, all in one. So, I mean, I'm sure throughout your career, you've learned a lot about the industry. I mean, I'm seeing it from a language perspective as well as, as a line producer. Would you have any little known facts that the average fan may not know about animation or CG specifically, or even the economics of making some of these shows, the 20-minute episode, a reality?
Yeah, so one of the things that actually was really interesting to me, that's kind of specific to the CG industry within Japan, because as I said, it's really not well known until recently within Japan. But the one thing that a lot of CG companies do is pachinko, which if anybody has ever, played those, there's all the little animations that play as you're, pulling your, I don't know. I don't actually play pachinko, but you push the buttons or whatever, and while you're waiting to find out if you won or not, then the little animations play, and very often those are CG. And the thing about that is that because pachinko is so heavily restricted within Japan, there's all the restrictions about how much they can advertise and what they can and can't do. And so because those companies make so much money and have kind of limited avenues to be able to use it, they tend to pour a lot of money into development of new machines, new IP, new, animations and everything. And so when you're creating the animation for Pachinko project, the budgets are really, really high. And the profit margins for the studio are really, really high. So what actually ends up happening is that you would take on these Pachinko projects and have, the very high profit margins on those. And that's what allows you to do other TV series projects, because those have, much more strict budgets. You're really bidding. If you're trying to get, a certain TV series work at your studio, you're often bidding against other studios and trying to get the project. And then you have to, once you have that project, you have to figure out ways to, hit the quality that the client is looking for while keeping your costs down as much as possible, trying to maximize, the amount of profit or at least break even for the studio. And that can be really hard. And so having these, high budget pachinko projects would allow you to take on a different kind of TV series or movie that maybe you're doing for the prestige because it's going to be really well known, or you're doing it to make a connection because it's with Amazon and you haven't had a chance to build a relationship with them before and stuff like that. So that's something that I think is a really interesting quirk of the Japanese animation industry specifically, but it also actually caused a lot of problems because a few years ago that somewhat stopped being the case. And there was a lot of talk about, if the government was going to change how the pachinko industry was regulated, and I think there was a lot of fear from those companies that, that things might change. And so they, in recent years, have stopped spending as much on new machines and, new IP and everything. And so those budgets and those orders are not what they were. And so for Polygon specifically, it definitely resulted in us having to try and, be more conscious of, okay, this TV series that before maybe we'd be willing to go a little bit into the red on it, but now, it's really important to make sure that we at least break even or that we hit a certain amount of profit. And it definitely changed the way a lot of things in the industry operated. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. I mean, that does not sound easy, and it's a very unique way to find funding. So I guess if I can move on to my last question then. 10 years is a long time to stay in Japan, and for a lot of expats, the choice to go home can sometimes be a very difficult one. Could you please share briefly about your decision to return to the States, what you're doing now, and then also any ways that you are remaining connected with your Japanese self, so to speak?
Yeah, I always knew that I didn't want to stay in Japan forever, but I also didn't really have a good sense of how long I did want to stay. For me, I was just always kind of like, at some point, I'll be ready to leave, and when it happens, I'll know. So I think for a lot of reasons, a few years ago, around 2017, 2018, I started feeling like maybe I was ready. And I think particularly I started feeling like I was at a point in my career where, I could actually make a good move, make a good kind of lateral move, and not have to start all over again at the bottom if I were to come back to the US. I actually had experience that I could leverage. And so I started kind of casually at first, but started looking around for jobs in the same industry back in the US. And it's hard to job search from another country, as I'm sure lots of you are aware. So eventually what I ended up doing was just deciding I'm going to pick a date that I'm going to leave Japan. And if I have a job by then, great. If I don't, we'll figure it out. That actually helped me a lot because I was able to work with Polygon, set my end date with them, giving them, I think I started talking to them in January of 2019, saying that I was thinking I was ready to leave. And I didn't actually, my last day of work there was the end of May. So, it ended up being a really long notice period. But because of that, I was able to fully hand off my projects. And also because it was a fixed set thing, a lot of my producers there, like, for example, the other American producer that I talked about before, were able to really help me, put the word out, talk to all their contacts, find out who was looking for, producers. And so I was able to get a new job offer before I left. And so what I ended up doing was joining which I think a lot of people have probably heard of. They're the place to watch anime everywhere except for within Japan, the one place that you can't see them. But for those of you who aren't aware, Crunchyroll is a streaming service. It's basically Netflix, but for Japanese anime only. So they made most of their business is just licensing Japanese shows to broadcast in the US and in other countries. But they had recently started experimenting with producing their own original animation, not just purchasing or funding other productions. And so I was hired on as a producer to manage two shows that were very traditional 2D animation, so very traditional anime, but all of the animation work and everything was being done at studios in Tokyo. And then I was going to be based in the US and sort of managing that from there. So it was a really, really great kind of transitional job for me because I was going back to the US, but I was still really heavily involved with the team in Tokyo. Pre-COVID, we made several business trips there to visit them. We had conference calls with them multiple times a day multiple times a week, and then, emails and everything. So that was really good because I got to kind of get some of the experience on the American side that I hadn't ever had up to that point. And then also still keeping my Japanese language skills up, keeping that connection. But then the show that I was working on for them, we pretty much wrapped early this year. And so I was taking that as an opportunity to look around for kind of what else was out there. And so I ended up taking a job where I currently work with Netflix. So I've only been there since the end of March, so just a few months, still kind of getting used to everything there. But right now what I do is another kind of different step for me, but I'm working on their original animated series production management, so similar to what I have been doing, but right now working specifically on series that are in the early development stages. So Netflix has not yet given it the green light to say we are absolutely for sure going to make this show. It's the part before that where you're kind of trying to develop a pilot and figure out if the show is going to be something.
Very nice. So just to follow up then real quickly, do you have any specific way that you're staying connected to Japan? You mentioned that you're doing some archery as well and are previous conversations, but
yeah, that's regular American kind of archery though. I looked up, and I think the closest there is a Southern California kudo, but it's down in Orange County, which is quite a ways away from me. So I don't know if I'll be able to get down there. Yeah, I was actually able to pick kudo back up while I was at the IUC, and that was really fun to get to do that again after having missed out on it when I was in college. But then in typical Japanese fashion, once I started working, I didn't have time to do it anymore. So yeah, I am doing regular American archery here now, but no, I'm actually, that's kind of something that I'm realizing I'm going to need to work on for the first time, because at my last job when I was at Crunchyroll, I was still, using and interacting with Japan very naturally every day, whereas now for the first time, I'm not. And so, I'm definitely going to have to try and make room in my, room for myself to maybe find like a conversation group or something like that around and make sure that I'm still keeping up with it.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Again, thank you so much for your time. That's all for our moderator-led questions. Thank you so much, Sarah, again.
So we had tons of questions in the question box, so I'm just going to kind of go through some of them. So, of course, job hunting in Japan is really tough. So when you were first graduated from the IUC or thereafter, what kind of resources did you use?
Honestly, it was just a lot of looking at job boards and stuff like that. I know we had like a job board at the IUC, and I was certainly looking at that. There wasn't a lot on there when I was there though. But I also go out and use some other recruiting firms, like temp agencies. When I was hired at Polygon for the first time as a translator, it was like a hakken deshain. So I was first employed for the first 6 months as hakken via, I think, a company called Temp Staff, which is a pretty big company, and then became keyaku deshain after that. So yeah, I don't know if I have a whole lot of super useful information on that, since it really was just a lot of looking at job boards and then meeting with some of those temp agencies. But
right. Yeah, I think that's a way that works for a lot of IUC students. But I mean, hey, it is what it is. You got super lucky, and your search worked really well for you. But okay, so the next question we have is, what is Netflix doing in the area of bringing down post-production costs? Do you know?
I'm really not sure if I can answer that, probably partially just because I still have only been there for about 3 months at this point. And also I work very strictly in development, which is pretty much the opposite end of post-production. So I still unfortunately don't have a lot of visibility into that area. I do know it's definitely something that, I think as you mentioned, like everyone is worried about that and wondering how you're going to make that work. But I'm sorry, I really don't think I have a good answer for that.
No worries. Another one we have about Netflix Global and Netflix Japan. Do you know about the relationship between those two entities when it comes to producing shows?
Yeah. So the way that when it comes to animation, the way that Netflix has things divided is we have adult animation, which is, mainly the stuff like BoJack Horseman, for example. That's actually more under the live action umbrella. They're fairly separate from the rest of the animation studio. And then we have under everything that's not for adults, so everything that's kids and family and preschool, we have the features department. Then we have series, and then they have what's called indies, which is somewhat of a misnomer, but that indies basically refers to shows that are kind of based outside of the US. So it includes shows from, African countries, or shows from Australia, or shows from Europe. And so that's kind of under the indies umbrella. And then the anime stuff specifically actually is pretty self-contained within the Tokyo office. Netflix does have a Tokyo office, and they're the ones that are in charge of acquisitions, licensing, production for pretty much any anime show that is on Netflix's server, anything that's not, produced in the US. So there's a lot of opportunities for that sort of work in the Tokyo office.
Cool. Yeah, I always see Netflix is hiring on LinkedIn in Japan. So
they definitely are. Yeah, and there's a lot of different roles, because I think a lot of times people don't necessarily think about it, but for whether you're using Japanese, but also within the animation industry in general, you can be a lawyer for an animation studio. You can be an accountant for an animation studio. There's lots of different jobs that you wouldn't necessarily think of that can still be related to that. And the same goes for Japanese as well, because if it's in the Tokyo office, if you're talking about whether it's an office manager or, like I said, legal people or finance people, you've got to have those Japanese language skills as well to work in the Tokyo office.
Yeah, definitely. It's totally necessary to be able to speak Japanese to some degree when you work in the country. So
but yeah, there's a lot of, if people are interested in maybe something in the entertainment scope, but you feel like, oh, I'm not an artist, or I'm not, this or that, there is still actually quite a lot of opportunity there. So.
Yeah, I think we have some more questions. Sabrina, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So where is Netflix looking for scripts, or what is the process of pitching a show? Does this fall in your department as well?
It absolutely does. Yeah. At least as far as relates to animation. I can't speak to if live action might be slightly different, but Netflix has what they call content executives, which are the people who decide what shows they want to buy and what shows they want to greenlight to put on service. And so those are some of the people that I work the most closely with. So typically what happens is, I think the actual pitch itself, there's a specific website portal that you have to put your pitches through. They very much discourage contacting people directly. Like anything gets redirected to this specific pitches portal. But once that happens, the content execs, they look through the pitches that come in. They might pick which people they want to come in and meet with. And if there's a pitch that the exec feels has potential, then they'll usually agree to bring it on board for a development phase at first. So it'll say, it'll be something like 6 months or a year. And they'll say, we're going to pay you to work with us for the next year to create a proof of concept, to create a pilot for this show. And, we'll work on fleshing out what the story is going to be and creating some visual stuff. Maybe you might do a storyboard and then edit that together into what's called an animatic. And so, the content exec will decide what it is they need to see to know whether they want to make the show or not. And so that's the phase that I'm working with. I'm the person who's effectively managing the production schedule and everything through that initial term. And then once those deliverables are finished, then you present them and you sort of do another pitch to the content exec, who decides yes or no. They may decide, I want to spend a little bit longer in development, work on this some more. It may be a hard no at that point, or they will say, if everything goes well, they'll say, yes, this looks great. I'm going to give you the green light, and we'll actually move into pre-production and production on the series itself.
Wow, that sounds like a really long process if you're like, 6 months to 1 year on a bunch of different shows.
It can be, yeah. And then the animation process itself is also very long. So, the shows that I'm working on now, assuming they go forward to a green light, they're not going to be released into the world until probably 2024 at the earliest.
Wow.
So it's a really long lead time.
Yeah. I feel like it's in my time zone, it's 5:59. So we have just 1 more minute, but maybe we can quickly answer this last question. If you have a script as an amateur, is there a way to get it into the right places where it's more likely to be seen?
The thing about a script is that you're very often not going to sell that script. I mean, like if you're a potential writer and you're trying to get your foot into the door, the chances of somebody saying like, I want to buy this script from you and make this thing is pretty slim. A lot of times what's going to happen is somebody will see that script and they'll say, I like, I think you have really great potential, and I'm not going to make this story that you have, but I want to hire you to write some episodes, be a staff writer on my show. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is that, just trying to make sure it shows off kind of your voice and your niche in terms of what kind of a writer you are. But as far as getting it more likely to be seen, a common way that a lot of people, at least in TV, a lot of writers get in the industry is you start working as a production assistant or a script coordinator or a writer's assistant. And a lot of those people are people who want to, it's the production side, which is what I do, but it's people who want to be writers. And by getting to do that, you make the connections that you need, you get your foot in the door. And it's not at all uncommon for someone to be, say, a script coordinator or an assistant on a season of a show, and then maybe the next season they get hired on to write some episodes. So
yeah, it seems like people make that jump from different departments, and like you said, you talked to somebody who was producing and then they said, why don't you come work with me on my team? So
yeah, and especially production, the management side where I am, it's pretty uncommon actually to have someone who just wants to do that. It's a lot of times it's people who are artists or writers or storyboard designers, and that's really what they want to do. And they're just kind of doing the management thing to get their foot in the door.
Yeah, definitely. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. Your talk was so interesting. I just feel like this is a perspective that many people want, or your job is something many people want to do, but not an opportunity that a ton of people come into contact with. So it's just so great to have you here. And it really shows the wide variety of jobs that IUC alumni have.